today's topic, probably a month or 2 or 3 ago, may have seemed like a stretch because our talk was originally titled The Resurgence of ISIS. And as you can see, a few months ago, maybe we didn't think that was such a critical talk. But this morning, yesterday, day before, I don't know how many times you've redone the talk, Ted, but quite a few. Things are moving very quickly. So we are very lucky to have 2 of our esteemed NSF colleagues present on the resurgence of the Islamic State, Syria, Iraq, and other places worldwide. So with that, let me introduce Ted Morse, who many of you know, who had an esteemed career in USAID and who will lead today's presentation. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you. I'll introduce my esteemed colleague, who you all know, Dick Hobbs, when we go back and forth with the mic. As was announced by Maureen, this was to talk about the war with ISIS. And unfortunately, it needs to go on, but it's been overtaken by the war between Turkey and the SDF. And so you're going to find that we're a little bit rusty on some of this, but hang with us. We are going to just set the stage in terms of what was going on for the decision to either stay in there or withdraw earlier. And let me start with that. And the main points, as you see, that what we were going to cover is the caliphate was defeated, but ISIS itself was not. And that they had dispersed all the way through Iraq and Syria, and so they were still even a bigger threat when they were not congregated in Mosul and Raqqa. And they've adopted not unit tactics, but now going to guerrilla tactics, which makes them much, much harder to confront. And then, as Dick will tell you, they have new orders to expand worldwide. But we want to spend the most of our time on the consequences of the president's decision, which I only heard 3 days ago, Monday morning, in terms of the U.S. troop withdrawal, or now pull back, as you will. And we'll spend most of the time on that. But first of all, just to document, there was going to be a lot of discussion of how many of the ISIS people went to what locations. It's not as relevant now, but as you can see from that map, there was probably 10,000 of them that came out of that area and dispersed throughout the entire region, and some of them embedded with the internally displaced, the IDP people, some with civilians. The same way with those that went out through Syria. Again, almost another 10,000 fighters. They were not sitting in Mosul and Raqqa just to be annihilated. They knew they were going to have to fight, and they were on the move. In terms of where they were in April, when we had our last look at that, you can see where they are literally in some of the gray areas moving around the country. We'll come back to where they are now. The point here, and Dick will pick it up a little bit, in terms of al-Baghdadi came out of hiding after 5 years and gave a new charge. Dick, you pick it up?
ISIS is ISIS or Daesh or ISIL or ISIS, whichever you want to call them, is down but not out. They have $300 million in their coffers and affiliates in many countries. Now, why is 300 million important? Because they had billions before, and the difference is that they are not controlling and administering territory now. It takes a lot of money to run the electricity, the sewer, the education, the roads, and everything else. They don't have that now. They're in the guerrilla mode, and all they have to worry about now is paying troops and getting weapons. So $300 million is still plenty. And you'll notice that BBC said there were 3,670 attacks worldwide in 2018. That's 10 a day. So they're not just doing nothing. They claimed big attacks in Afghanistan, the Sinai. Now, the Sinai, you might remember that the Russians lost an airplane with 244 people on it. So these are big things. And also in the Sinai, they've called for attacks throughout Egypt, and particularly against the Copts, the Christian Copts. Somalia, U.S. troops involved there also. Nigeria, Yemen, and the Philippines. On this map from the far right, you got Abu Sayyaf over in the Philippines, where we've had U.S. troops involved. Then you have the area in Bangladesh, which you don't hear much about. Then you hear the one in Khorasan, which is Afghanistan, and the movement in Uzbekistan joined them in 2015. We have troops heavily involved in Afghanistan. Then you've got the core area that Ty talks about, that Ted talks about. Then you've got Libya, which we've got U.S. involvement in Libya. Then you've got the Western Sahara, which is Mali, and gets into Burkina Faso and Niger. The French take the lead in Mali because old colony, and then you got the other one in Africa, which is Boko Haram, which is a brutal area where they've been killing so many Christians and so on. So other areas that have sworn allegiance, they swear bayah to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He called for the whole world of the Muslim world to join him. Other allegiances, which are either allegiances or support or individuals, are in the Caucasus, which gives the Russians their problems. Yemen, we have involvement in there again. Sinai, Algeria. Actually, there are two in Somalia that are offshoots from al-Shabaab. So it's an interesting area. And as you can see, the U.S., two more, there we are. Daesh has said, you are the target. It comes home to us. Ted?
Okay, we were focusing on the fight with ISIS because literally we were hearing that the American public, as well as everybody from the president on down, was saying, got it, thank you, was saying that they've been defeated. But in terms of what we found was that there was a need for a decision about whether we were going to do what the president was talking about in December, to withdraw because of ISIS had been defeated, or whether we were going to recognize that we were still faced with a fight in there. That's kind of where we were focusing before. In terms of how we were responding to this call from al-Baghdadi to continue the fight and to put it worldwide against everybody, but in Syria and Iraq, we had about 4,000 troops in Iraq and 2,000 in Syria, and the mission was not to be boots on the ground fighting, but it was very much to support the fighters by the Arabs and the Kurds who make up the SDF, the Syrian Defense Force. And it was in a support mission, and it was very important, as it still is today, because our troops on the ground add that experience, and especially the technology, the integration of intelligence, and help with the targeting that are very necessary for the SDF to literally chase and destroy ISIS. They had extensive use of the drones, and I want to show you just briefly this.
This is where the operation is underway right now, deep in the Anbar Desert, about 50 to 60 miles from the Syrian border. You can see the Iraqi troops behind me and the tribal militia setting up this defensive perimeter. They are here to find these ISIS fighters. They've captured another 7 of them, captured and killed here in the search for these fighters. The new reality, this is where the ISIS fighters are hiding.
They are guarded, fueled, and ready for flight. In the skies over Iraq, 8 hours at a time.
This is where they're actually operating the drones that are doing surveillance right now over the Iraqi desert, the mountains and the caves where they believe these ISIS fighters are still hiding. You can see this private first class is looking at some terrain right now.
We are allowed inside, a rare view of what it is they see, the kind of terrain they're scouring.
That's the way we were responding, not with boots on the ground, but supporting the SDF to basically do the fighting. That still needs to be done, but it's been complicated, obviously. I woke up Monday morning to find that the decision that we were laying out for all of you in terms of a decision to either withdraw or to stay and fight had been taken by the president, and it gets a little confused of whether it was a decision to withdraw totally or whether to pull back. Here's my understanding of what he had said. He understood that Turkey was going to invade, and for that reason it was important to pull at least the 50 of the 1,000 that we have up on that border, the 50 that are in literally Tel Aviv, and we're coordinating on the kinds of things that you saw in terms of the drones doing the intelligence gathering, location, etc. And withdrawing those out of harm's way, and agreed supposedly with the president that there was not going to be any untoward actions against the Kurds, but that there would be heavily sanctions, economic sanctions if they were. And the Turks had said they would be responsible for the ISIS militants, which we'll see as we go further along is going to be extremely difficult, and I'll come back to that. But he has consistently read the American public right. The American people are tired of these wars. He calls them these senseless, endless wars. And it's true. You look at the length of time that we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and the American public and the president have said, we want to withdraw out of that. He made a campaign pledge to do that. The question is, how do we do it? And right now, 3 days after he made that announcement, I think all of you will have questions of whether the way to do it is the right way that has been started so far. In terms of the policy, I said that was confused. As far back as December of 18, the president had said ISIS is defeated, we're going to withdraw. Several people in the cabinet in June, July, August had said that's not the right way to do this, but the president repeated it last month that ISIS is defeated and we're going to withdraw. Now, there are 4 areas that we want to focus on that are highly volatile. In terms of Turkey, now not ready to invade, but has invaded Syria. The STF, Syria Defense Force, again, made up of Kurds and Arabs, that are repositioning their troops to fight with Turkey, and they are obviously diminishing the fight with ISIS. In fact, some of the SDF commanders have said, we're going north to fight. We're not going to just fight ISIS right now. And then ISIS has said repeatedly, including what Baghdadi had said, that when he called his people to rise up again just a couple of weeks ago, the idea was to attack the ISIS fighters, free them from the camps, the 24 different in IDP camps and the 14 prisons to join the resurgence. And as you'll see from a map I'll put up, they're not someplace that's just in that safety zone that the Turks said they're going to establish. And I want to call attention that simultaneously over in Iraq, there are unprecedented demonstrations. Some of you know I went into Iraq with the troops in 2003 and was, quote, the mayor of Baghdad, the chief administrator. Well, the man I appointed was assassinated sitting on the street to become the new mayor. I went back, and in 2004, this is an area that is very destabilized, but they've not seen anything like the demonstrations that are going on right now, where the young people are just demanding that the corruption and the better public services be. And as you'll see, Iran is already sending people in to stabilize that. And that's not in our best interest. In terms of preparing for that breakout of the IDP camps and the breakout of the prisons, you can see how those are scattered all over Syria and the north part of Iraq. And how then the Turks are going to be able to secure all that, we don't know. What we heard, the promise is that to our president, by the president of Turkey, they will take responsibility. It's going to be that the Turks have to go all over those two countries to be able to do that. And Maureen and I were talking just before dinner, at breakfast. You see how late I was up. And that we heard this morning that two high-value prisoners have been moved out of the camps in the northern part of Syria, in those detention centers. We think that those two are British citizens and that they are the beetles that we were holding and SDF was holding. They're the ones that cut the heads off on video camera, and they've been moved back. We can come back to that, and basically, who's going to keep those detention centers and those IDP centers secure? We have a lot of discussion on that. This map tries to show the different safety zones. This is very interesting. This is the area where Turkey is planning to extend their time. Supposedly it's about 430 kilometers across, and they say it's between 20, 25, 30, depending on what report, is deep. And they want to cleanse that of the Turkish so that they don't have the Turkish joining up with the Turkish PKK in their own country. The Kurds, yeah. But what shows you in here is the areas that ISIS has support still. These checkered areas, they're all over the place. And so you're going to have ISIS breaking out and coming out of their hiding, as we've already seen it. They've been in the caves, they've been in the tunnels, they've been in the valleys. They're in areas where they have a lot of support of their cause, and they're going to be coming out at the same time that this war has started now between Turkey and the Kurds. This is what Dick was covering a minute ago. And in terms of that war, we think that at the time there were between 5,000 and 10,000 troops on the border. We now are hearing reports every morning now that at least 10,000 of those are still on the border, but the Turks have started the war first with air drops and then with artillery, and starting in that Tel Abyad area, which is over in here. This is where they're starting, but they're also now, as of this morning, hitting in this area. They're all used to know about Raqqa and Aleppo, and there are those who say Turkey wants to push the Kurds all the way back into this area where the Syrian regime controls it. And that line basically follows the Euphrates River, and they want to push them, the Kurds, on the other side of the river. This is where there is one of the big holding camps for the families of the center of the SDF, mainly women and children.
Families of the ISIS. Families of ISIS.
Thank you. I'm still awake, not awake. And that they have internal security by the ISIS itself, primarily women enforcing the internal security. And the SDF has been doing perimeter security, but at the same time, ISIS supporters have been coming out of that camp and the other one down into Iraq and going across into the border of Iraq and into Syria. So that is a huge population of 70,000 family members that somebody's going to have to decide in this war what's going to happen to them. In terms of what Dick and I were talking about, what's the consequences of this for different parts of the equation? Dick, can you pick it up on the military side?
Okay. The first question is, are we assuming that in the Northeast, whether it's a pullback or a withdrawal, there's a big difference. If we're just pulling back 50 to 200 people from that 20, 30 kilometer safe zone, that's one thing, because they would be wiped out quickly in a Turkish armored attack. Otherwise, is it the question of whether the president is actually going to try to withdraw completely from Syria? That we do not know. That's the $64 question. We need to stop the maneuvers next to the Turkish invasion area. We aren't doing anything up there. We've pulled back from there. We've got diminished anti-ISIS maneuvers without the SDF now. The SDF is totally occupied looking north at the Turkish invasion. So they are not interested in the prisons, they're not interested in ISIS, they're not interested in anything else. And we've got the reduced anti-ISIS maneuvers in Iraq, again in anticipation of American withdrawal, which we do not know whether that's what it is or not.
Yep.
So now, what's the Syrian government doing? Well, the first thing they want to do is they would like to restrain that Turkish invasion. That's hard to do. They might want to take back some of those areas that the SDF took over earlier so they could get some territory. The main thing that would be the Deir ez-Zor area where they get the oil, some of that oil area that they want to get back. And, of course, they're going to be aided by Russia and Iran. You pick up ISIS?
Okay. So what's the consequences of the president's decision in terms of ISIS itself? They had said they were already resurging, and we've seen in the last 48 hours that that's happening. They feel that there's enough chaos, and frankly, ISIS really expands their activities in this chaos. They have dispersed their fighters. They've come out of those cells that were hiding since Mosul and Raqqa fell, and they feel that ISIS now can have a diminished ability for the SDF to fight them with this indecision as whether the U.S. is pulling back from the border or are we totally withdrawing. And we have conflicting policy decisions out of Washington State. And the ISIS feels that they are now free to attack both the IDP and the prisoners' camps and let them out. And of course, they do this so that they can get additional fighters and resources. They play on the religious aspect of you don't want our women being held by these foreigners and abused in there, but as I said earlier, the internal part of the security in the IDP camps is maintained by, if you will, by the ISIS women themselves. In terms of what the consequences are of the president's decision for the Syrian Defense Force, the SDF, our partners that we have fought with in Iraq and elsewhere, the Kurds are the main part of that, the main fighting part of that. But they said already that they are withdrawing the guards from the prisons and the ITPs, which opens it up for the ISIS to go ahead and break into those and have prison breaks. They are moving their fighters north to confront the Turks, and frankly, you've heard this on the news, they're feeling abandoned once again by the U.S. And what we expect, that the Arab part of the SDF is going to break away from the Turk part of the SDF, and they're going to seek an alliance with Assad with the common objective of keeping Turkey out of Syria. In terms of the ISIS prisoners themselves, we hear that there is at least 1,000 foreign fighters in those prisons, guarded by SDF in those 14 prisons, as I said, and they're all over the region. They're not just in this 400-kilometer, 20-kilometer deep area that is called the safe zone. And if they are freed by ISIS in a prison break, and they're dispersed to fight locally or worldwide, or will there be U.S. interim guards? And as we heard this morning, the U.S. has moved a few of the high-value people out of there, and I don't think the U.S. troops are going to leave those areas unguarded as the SDF pulls their guards off before the Turks come in and say they're going to guard it. That's a huge, huge problem. The Turkish troops are moving to guard in all locations, or are they only going to be in the safe zones? I don't think we know what that is. In terms of in the IDP camps, in both Iraq and Syria, the numbers that keep getting quoted that there's 170,000 in these internally displaced people camps. The 24 very makeshift camps. These are not their usual refugee camps. They're very, very sparse, and they are not happy, and they are not safe. It's very difficult. As I've said, 60% of the people in those camps are children, and frankly, we have multiple reports of those children already being radicalized while they're in those camps. We've seen the pictures of where the children are raising ISIS flags inside the IDP camps. Tells you how fast that radicalization and who we will be fighting in the next generation if we don't do something different. In terms of those IDP camps, we don't know whether the ISIS is going to break them out for sure, whether U.S. guards will move off, whether the Turkeys will be there in time. It's unwelcome home in the Assad government areas. Those people are identified with ISIS. So if they go back into areas governed by Assad, they're not going to be welcome. And they're already being discriminated, abused, and raped in ISIS by ISIS people themselves who feel that they have been sold out in those IDP camps. In terms of the refugees, how are they affected by the president's decision? 3.5 or 4 million, depending on what report you read, of the Turks and the Syrians are in Turkey. Turkey is using this in the talk with the president to say, we can't keep holding and take care of all of these refugees. We're going to send them back home. We can't send them back home until there's a safe haven. We're invading this country to create the safe haven, and then we're going to send them home. One of the problems is that they're sending them into an Arab area. And that's fine as part of the refugees that are Arabs. But what are you going to do with those that are not Arabs, and you're moving them into Kurd areas and Arab areas that are going to be more conflict in the, quote, safe zones? They don't know what to do with the Syrian Kurd refugees while they're moving the Arab refugees back into Turkey. If they do that, and how you're going to do it, provide the services, we don't know. The Turkey is reluctant to release the Iraqi refugees into the northern Iraq autonomous areas that are basically run by the Kurds very well in Iraq, because they feel that if they release the refugees from Turkey to go into northern Iraq, they'll be part of the PPK communist rising against Turkey itself. Tough to deal with. In terms of, I wanted to mention, as I did, the Iraq protests. Iraqis are fearing there's more refugees from Turkey coming in. Those are popular protests. They're not being organized by any one group. I've seen the insurgents in the protests, and this is different in Iraq, very. The Iranian influence is both direct and through their surrogates in Iraq called Popular Mobilization Forces. And because of these demonstrations now in Iraq, Iran is sending people in under the guise that they want stability for the next pilgrimage. As most of you know, the Shia pilgrimage homeland is not in Iran, it's in Iraq, at Karbala. And there have already been demonstrations down there, and so this is an excuse for the Iranians to say, we're going to bring peace around our areas. In terms of the last one, I guess we really want to hear from all of you. What do you think the reputation and the reliability is of the United States after this move in the last 4 days? What's the reputation with Congress, and what are they going to do? Does the public support this? They want us out of there, that's true, but are they going to want us out of there at a situation that where maybe the Turkeys are annihilating an awful lot of Kurds. And then the split, even within the administration, as we have seen before. We want to hear from you. We'll stop and take some questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for a great presentation. It was a bit of a whirlwind. So we have numerous questions that will helpfully help clarify what you just presented and get into the bottom of what's going on, even if we don't know where we're going from here. So, Dick, I'm going to start with you because you used the phrase. We hear the phrase ISIS, ISIL, Daesh. Can you tell us, is there a difference, or are those all meaning the same thing?
There's a slight difference only in time. It started out as the Islamic State in Iraq, then it moved into Syria, became the Islamic State in Syria. Then when the June of 2014, when he announced the caliphate, this is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he announced the Islamic State. Earlier it was called, and it used different terms, Islamic State, ISIL, Islamic State in the Levant, which is the northern part, including area into Lebanon also, or ISIS is Sham, S-H-A-M, which is the same thing, meaning the Levant. So ISIS and ISIL are really the same thing, and IS, or Daesh, Daesh is the pejorative term referring to the Islamic State. The Islamic State is the current or former organization which actually controlled territory in Iraq and Syria, Islamic State.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to do my best to organize these in along country lines as best we can. So the first set of questions are going to be around Turkey. Okay, so let me start with the most obvious question that to Ted that you may or may not have an answer for, and that's what's Turkey's goal in invading Syria?
Well, let's start with the fact that, is this on?
Yeah, just pull.
Won't come forward. Can you hear me? Let's start with the fact that in Syria, they have 12 million Kurdish population. It ranges between 18 and 20%. And the Kurdish group has for years, for hundreds of years, been asking for their own homeland. You've all heard the Kurds are the largest ethnic minority in the world that does not have their own homeland. And they are scattered between the 12,000 in Turkey, 6 million in Turkey, 6 million in Iraq, 6 million in Syria, and probably 2 million in Iran. There are others that are up in Turkmenistan and Caucasus. Dick?
Right, that's right.
And so Turkey is very fearful that the guerrilla terror, which we have recognized as a terrorist organization, PKK, made up of the Kurds that want a homeland to unite all Kurds, is putting bombs, attacks inside Turkey, and they want to get no more Turks out of the refugees or support for the PKK in their own country by the Kurds in the SDF, that if the SDF Kurds control that area of Syria, Turkey feels they're going to come across, join their own Kurds to continue to carry out insurgencies inside Turkey. Therefore, their objective is twofold. One is to have a safe zone, which we in the U.S. and they had agreed to about a month ago with joint patrols to make sure that the SDF Kurds did not go across the border into Turkey. That has fallen apart now with the agreement to invade instead. And the objective of the Turkey still is to have a safe zone along that 430-kilometer border where they can move the SDFs and the Kurds out of Turkey, not all 12 million, and to move the Arabs out of there and as a buffer zone with their country. They're after a buffer zone. How deep, how far, how long, we don't know.
One I could add is the YPG, which is that group of the SDF. That's the Kurds who are in the area where we have been partners with them against ISIS. The Turks consider them part of the PKK. Bad people. They're scared to death of them. They're almost paranoid about the whole PKK problem. PKK has changed quite a bit in recent years, but it was a very violent organization in earlier years, as Ted pointed out. So what they want to do is move 1 million Arab refugees out of Turkey and settle them in those little hamlets. Unfortunately, those little hamlets are occupied by Kurdish families. So you're going to have a real humanitarian problem when you kick 1 million people out to put 1 million people in. That's what we're up against.
Excellent, thanks. Dick, let's follow up with this. From a military standpoint in Turkey, Turkey has recently purchased military hardware from Russia. How do you see Russia's influence in the region changing, growing, morphing?
The Russian influence is enormous. You've got them as the critical element, along with Iran and Hezbollah, supporting the Syrian government of al-Assad, and the sale of the S-400 missile system to Turkey just solidified the relationship of the Russians with Turkey. It put us in a very bad position. The president has hesitated to cut off everything, but he's threatened to. It puts us in a very weak position that we're in, and I think it's going to be in the news more. And Putin has tried to make another sale to him, so I think this is going to come to a head soon.
While we're talking about the military and the hardware part that Dick brought up, Turkey has huge advantage in this war. They have the aircraft, the artillery, the very heavy weaponry. The SDF doesn't have anywhere near that kind of weaponry. There's no doubt that if this is prolonged, that heavily weaponry on the part of the Turks are going to overwhelm the SDF, but they're not going to just sit there and fight forever. You will find that they do exactly what ISIS did. They will disperse into the desert to fight again another time. But the huge difference in the weaponry between the two of them is unbalanced, to say the least.
Okay, so let me put this succinctly to the two of you. We have Russia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds. Who's on what side?
What day?
What time is it?
Oh, and the U.S. And the U.S. Don't forget that.
I'll start just by one. Some of you remember about 2 years ago that I did give a talk here about ISIS and its fight within Syria. And it started with the Syrian civil war. If you look at the Syrian civil war and the number of militias that are supposedly fighting Assad, you would think they would be able to overcome them, even with the Russian and the Iranian support. But the problem is they're not united. And the answer to your question about who's on what side, on what hour or what day is those militias, those tribal have allegiances that go back and forth. It isn't anything that is as firm as we've seen on the part of the Kurds and their allegiance to work with us to fight ISIS. It's such a fluid situation, and frankly, these tribal groups will change and change for obvious reasons. who's going to keep me safe? Who's
Go
gonna
with the
keep-
winner.
Huh?
Go with the winner. Who they perceive the winner is at
It's
the
a
minute.
hard question.
So let me drill down on that a little bit because obviously I know there's probably a lot of confusion, and there's been a lot of more confusion generated in the last couple of days. The United States is had been allied with the Kurds, who fought as part of the Syrian Defense Forces, and obviously Turkey is a NATO element. So, and we value Turkey's participation in NATO. So the question then is, so which side are we on? That's one. And the second is, so what does Europe and NATO do in this? Or do they have a role?
Well, Europe and NATO doesn't have much of a role, but we have both British and French small operations, mainly special forces, in with our people. It's a very interesting problem because what are we doing? And we got this so-called NATO ally, which is under tremendous pressure in the parts of the government that they're not really an ally. And right now they're fighting and killing the people that we've been working with, taking on the Daesh. So it's a terrible problem for the U.S. government to sort all this out and to figure out what is our long-range interest. That's the thing we've never done, is what is our long-range interest?
Just a word more on that. There is a distinction on the part of the United States between the Kurds that are in the SDF fighting in Syria and in Iraq, as distinct from the Kurds who make up the PKK. And we have debated this with Turkey for a long time. As an ally, as a NATO ally, we agree the PKK within your borders is a terrorist organization. But we do not see that the Kurds, as part of SDF, as our partners fighting ISIS, are part of that. And we have maintained that in terms of the balance we see with a NATO ally up until this invasion.
Right. And you wonder why we're confused. Okay, so let's just take the Kurds right now. You mentioned the fact that they're the largest dispersed ethnic group with no homeland. Is what's happening now, do you think, is that going to lead to them being able to establish independence? Or will this weaken them so much that they, like you said, disperse to the desert, live to fight another day?
I have to give a personal opinion. I don't see any of the countries that house Kurd minorities changing their borders. Not anything like we saw splitting Eritrea off from Ethiopia, etc. I think what we may see, if we get a peaceful transition, that the same thing that happened in Iraq. You have the northern area populated by the Kurds has become a regional autonomous area recognized by Baghdad with some understanding of how to split the oil revenues in Iraq, but there is a great deal of autonomy in the north for the Iraqis. That could, if you ever saw that peaceful transition, even happen in Turkey itself. The proposals that have been made year after year after year would be for Turkey to do the same thing, to give more autonomy to the Kurds, and to give more, in Syria, to give more autonomy to the Kurds. But in terms of them getting their own homeland, I'm afraid the Ottomans settled that years and years ago.
Well, they came up with, it's actually somebody, just one of the State Department or somebody, some person just mentioned again that maybe it's time to create Kurdistan. But as you mentioned, it's very difficult. I can't visualize the Turks giving up 1/3 of their country, and the Iranians are violently against any Kurdish homeland. The only place that it might have any chance would be in Syria, as long as Assad doesn't have control. That would be the only one that might get an autonomous region, and that's what Turkey is in there for now, to prevent that.
Maureen, can I build on that to mention one thing? Since the Syrian civil war started, what is it now, 14 years ago?
2011.
And
2011, 8 years ago.
and the attempts have been made internationally to have a peace agreement and a peaceful transition. They have all failed. But there is another agreement that is being crafted right now, and it's being led by the Russians and the Turkish with the Syrians and the Iranians to have a new constitution drafted for Syria that would somehow give ethnic minorities more autonomy, more recognition, and have rights under the Constitution. Most people don't give this peace agreement approach any more chance of operating than the half a dozen before it. But frankly, and I will tell you my prejudice of 37 years as an American diplomat, you're not going to settle this war on the battlefield. You're going to have to find a diplomatic, political solution to it. And frankly, for the U.S. not to be part of the current peaceful drafting of a Syrian constitution is just leaving it open where we're sitting out and not being able to play a part to influence that to a success. That's my own personal bias. Excuse me.
Great. Okay, we're just going to keep digging down into this until we're totally confused. There was a Wall Street Journal article yesterday. It claimed that the U.S. supplied ISIS with thousands of arms to oppose Bashar al-Assad, proving it's a little hard to figure out which side of this we're on. If we continue our engagement in Syria, are we going to be facing our own weapons in the fight? Dick?
Well, I don't follow that article. I don't think we gave anything to Daesh. I think somebody's been smoking the wrong material.
It was in the Wall Street Journal.
Well, that doesn't prove anything, or else it does prove something. Whatever. Yes, we're going to run into some of our own weapons because we supply so many weapons to so many different countries that they come in. You got to remember that the big supporters of part of the effort against Assad is supported by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, right, Ted? So those are two big, and we've supplied them with a lot of weapons. So the answer to your question is yes.
One way or another, we're going to be facing our own weapons.
You're going to see American weapons that, as a NATO ally, Turkey has. There are going to be weapons that we have supplied to the Syrian defense partners, the SDF partners, and that those aren't all going to be collected by a Turkish invasion. They will be done just like in so many other places. We were talking about in the Maoist guerrillas in Nepal just a minute ago. Half of those weapons get hidden. And those are weapons, yes, that we have supplied.
And we've supplied weapons to some of the various militias and types of the 50 or so different groups in northern Syria.
That's right.
Right. Okay, so we're fighting ourselves there as well.
Our
weapons. Let's bring it closer to home. As you know, and we heard in the reports when there was mass migration of refugees from the fighting in Syria and Iraq into Europe, that there was a concern that dispersed fighters would essentially infiltrate the refugee path and show up in Europe and potentially even the United States. Is it in ISIS's operational plan to try and use that refugee path to get into both the United States and Europe to continue their operations, or is their real goal to stay and fight in Syria and Iraq and Turkey?
No, it's worldwide. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi established the Islamic Caliphate and called himself Khalif Ibrahim or Caliph Abraham. He called it for all Muslims in the world to support him, and that this caliphate was the caliphate for the entire Muslim world, and they should all give obedience to him. He's called for this all across these different countries that I mentioned, but there are 57 countries in the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and almost every one of them there is either an affiliate or support or individuals. And now you have a great number in Europe. We've seen the attacks in Europe. We have them in Canada, which is a launching pad into the United States. We probably have thousands in the United States, that's at least according to Sebastian Gorka. And we had an ISIS camp 8 miles south of El Paso in Mexico. This has come home. All Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has to do is put out the word, go.
Let me build on that also. The origins of ISIS was Al-Qaeda. They originally were part of Al-Qaeda.
That's correct.
And they broke off from Al-Qaeda because they had some ideological differences. And that happened even at the time when both ISIS and Al-Qaeda were fighting us in the insurgency in Iraq. But it is the objective of ISIS to have a worldwide caliphate. And you can make the distinction with, say, the Taliban in Afghanistan. Many people feel the Taliban wants to limit its control to Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is conflicted. They have branches, but they're nowhere near as good as ISIS. ISIS has a fantastic media outreach that is far greater than whatever Taliban and Al-Qaeda have. And that has been re-energized at the time when al-Baghdadi surfaced a couple of months ago, where the first thing he said was not only, let's restart the fight in Syria and Iraq, let's not only release the prisoners out of the prisons and the IDPs, but we're going to re-energize our media. And they have radio, television, media, social media, magazines, by the thousands that come up and down on social media every single week. And so they still see that their objective is ISIS objective, create a worldwide caliphate. And of course, the Christians, the non-believers, are a big target of that.
Oh, okay. On that happy note, let's go to ally reliability. And I have two parts to this question. The first is on the U.S. side. If we walk away from the Kurds, what does that do in terms of our reliability as an ally? And the second question goes back to Turkey. If Turkey is a member of NATO, and they're supposedly an ally of ours, then how are they managing to form an alliance with Russia if they're integral to NATO, if NATO was put together to counter Russia? Okay, so
it's not a question for the group.
So
well, you could add one more, that our NATO ally Turkey is attacking our ally the Kurds.
Right.
Just to confuse it.
So reliability. U.S. reliability is an ally.
U.S. reliability being weakened is a very interesting subject. It's a very undefined and undefinable subject. I'm not sure it's as important as everyone makes it out. Everyone says, oh, no one will trust us and everybody will be worried about it. We're still the big clown on the street. And I don't think everybody's going to run away just because we've given up on the Kurds. We haven't necessarily given up on the Kurds. In the media playing that up very big. You have to keep listening to the president because he changes it every week as to what our real position is with regard to the Kurds. I don't think he wants to give them up. He is looking at his base. The American people are tired of these stupid wars and our involvement in the Middle East because we don't know what our objective is, and that's a whole different subject that Ted doesn't want brought in this one, because that is Islam, and we don't address that, even though the president has, on 2 or 3 occasions, used the term radical Islam terrorism, which is good for him. It's fantastic. That's better than anything we've had in the last 10 years. So we have a very interesting problem because we don't know what our strategic objective is, and we're playing with tactics. And I'll go back to Steve Metcalf, wherever he is, who taught me about whack-a-mole, and we are playing whack-a-mole, and we're going to play whack-a-mole until we decide what our objective is and who our enemy is, because we refuse to identify the enemy. Amen.
So,
Without that, okay.
Ted, diplomatic answer?
Well, I think the reliability and unreliability of the United States with partners and countries around the world also start with their self-interest, just as we start with our self-interest. Whether or not this will undermine it, people are confused at the moment. Countries are confused. Whether it will preclude new alliances, frankly, those partnerships, those alliances, the reliability, the credibility of those depends on each country with each issue at each time. There is, as Dick said, an overall respect for our economic power, our military power, and in respect for our moral and ethnic power, which we cannot abandon. There is a concern that we're abandoning, if you will, our moral and ethnic position with the Kurds because they have been our partner in fighting in Iraq, our partners in fighting now in Syria with the SDF. And so there are those who say, wait a minute, despite all our military and economic political power, what about the erosion in our basic value system in terms of our basic fundamental reliability of a nation of people and what we believe and stand for? And I think that has to be factored in.
Excellent. So I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds to sum up, not so much what everybody would like to have answers to, the questions everybody wants answers because you don't have answers. But in 30 seconds, what would you tell this audience to pay attention to? What particular things should they be watching in order to be able to become more informed on this topic as it evolves? Dick.
$64, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think the important thing is to understand that there are strong arguments on all sides of these questions. The president has made a very strong statement without notifying his other people. However, the chairman of the Joint Chief and the SecDef were evidently in on that telephone call. So, but you have to realize that he is also playing to his base. The American people are sick and tired of 18 years of blowing away American troops, and we don't see any results. The Taliban is back stronger than it was years ago, probably, and the people are tired of it. Then you get the administration and the diplomats and the generals are saying, well, you can't just walk away from this thing. You've got to stay with it. Well, that goes back to my statement that you're stupid to stay with it if you don't know what the hell you're doing. So you got a real problem. Until you identify what your problem is, you're going to play whack-a-mole, as Steve taught me so thoroughly. You're going to keep playing whack-a-mole. I don't think the American people want whack-a-mole. I think they want solutions or get out.
And things to watch. At a base war level, I think we're going to have to watch whether or not the SDF and the Kurds are going to stand and fight, or whether they are going to give up. They're going to have a resistance, and then they're going to melt away. That's going to be a very important thing to keep your eye on. Secondly, I put it up, Dick, already, the references. I think we have to watch the extent to which the Turks really try to annihilate and do ethnic cleansing in whatever safe zone they have along the border. And that you have to look at how far and how deep and they're going to establish that zone, because they will establish. They have the military might to do that. And at what cost to the human suffering and killing that will go on to do that.
And what the president's reaction would be to that if you get ethnic cleansing, which you have to be. If you got 1 million Kurds and he wants to put 1 million Arabs in their houses, that's ethnic cleansing. And so what the president responds to that is going to be very critical.
To answer your question, Maureen, of what to watch, we put up at the end the references that we have been using. And I would say that, I don't know, let me have the paper there, well, it's gone. In terms of the CSIS, they have a podcast now, and it's almost every day. Similarly, the group that did the the Institute for the Study of War, they have a podcast also. Tune in to both the CSIS and the Institute of Study of War. The other thing to look at, that middle one, the final report of a bicameral, binational, bipartisan study that was actually started by Senator McCain before he passed on. And it was picked up on the Republican side by Murphy and on the Democratic side, on the House and the Senate side. And they've had about 1.5 years of bipartisan study that, and on September 24, they made the final report. It's an exhaustive report. I would urge that you look at those for basic references, those three and the podcasts by those two. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And we will put links up to all of this. But if you want something very quick and you use podcasts, go on and look for podcasts from CSIS and from the Institute of War. They're keeping daily information, and it is nonpartisan, very good reporting. So,
You want to say something about that book sale?
yeah. Okay, so you get to have the final word, Dick.
Well, thank you very much. Just going commercial. I have a few books here available if anybody's interested in them. And I have a special today, only $15 for any one of them. Be delighted to talk to you afterwards. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for an excellent presentation, and thank you for being here.